How's it going? I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy. I'm an organizational psychologist. I wrote the book Be Your Future Self Now, as well as the recent 10X is Easier Than 2X. This is the third book in the trilogy I wrote with Dan Sullivan. This is a really short video, but in this video, I'm going to break down a 3-step or even 3-leveled model that if you can understand this, if you can apply this, yes, it's simple, but it's incredibly deep. If you can apply this, you will experience massive change. Call it 10X change regularly, even 10X change every 2 to 3 years of your life. So let me go ahead and just walk you through the simpleness of this model and how you can apply it to achieve 10 years worth of growth every year, how you can 10X your life every 3 or so years. So the first level of this model is identity. The second level of this model is character. The third level of this model is mastery. And I'm going to walk you briefly through each and every step of these. So let's go ahead and start with identity. Your identity is the driver of your life. It's also the driver of your actions, behaviors, and choices. So the question is, what is identity? Most people's identity is rooted in their past or their present self. Your identity is the story you have for yourself, but it's also the standards with which you hold for yourself. And most people, when they think about identity, they have what Carol Dweck would call a fixed mindset. They've overly solidified their identity, which actually gives them what would be called a fragile identity, where they actually avoid failure, they avoid feedback. They're overly trying to define themselves, overly trying to prove themselves, and they're not willing to make big leaps. A lot of the research that I shared and uncovered in this book talks about the research on your future self and about how much more powerful it is to have your identity be based on your desired future self, which is not you. You are not your future self, just like you're not your past self. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago. You're not the same person you were 10 weeks ago. Your current self, as Dr. Daniel Gilbert would say, is as temporary and fleeting as the present moment. So rather than overly defining your current self, you really want to start thinking about your desired future self. As the saying goes, without vision, people perish. And so who is your future self? The great part is that's up to you. When it comes to identity, a lot of times people are looking for a script. They're trying to have someone tell them the answer about who they are, even asking God, who should I be? I love the concept and the idea that your identity is not a script which you learn, but it's actually a canvas within which you create. But it's actually a lot easier and less risky for us to actually seek a script. We would rather try to find and fulfill a role that someone else gives us, because then we don't have to make the choice of who we become. But your identity, even your future self, is a canvas. It's much more powerful and even much more faithful to have a vision that is impossible. Yes, pursue impossible goals. Pursue things which you think are impossible, but maybe which your future self does not think are impossible. Again, your future self is a different person than you. They have a different frame of reference. One way that is really helpful to look at this is thinking about your current self and recognizing that your current self is a different person than your former self. Your life right now may be completely out of the range of views of your former self. Your former self, maybe even 10 years ago or 3 years ago, might have thought certain things are impossible that for you now are completely normal. That is because you're not the same person as your former self. Well, you want to do the same thing with your future self. You don't want to impose or project your own limitations, your own views on your future self. Instead, with the idea of a canvas, you actually want to allow your future self to be a different person than you and to be creative. Who do you want your future self to be? One of the things that is discussed in this book is the research on constraint theory from Dr. Alan Bernard, that going for impossible goals is actually more practical and useful strategically than going for linear goals, call it 2x goals. The reason is that most pathways, most pursuits, most strategies will not get you to 10x or impossible goals. But you want to think about an impossible goal, and you also want to think in terms of what Gay Hendricks would call a big leap. That big leap is you at a completely new level. And one of the things that Dr. Gay Hendricks talks about in that book is that most people, they have an aversion to an incredible life. The reason is because subconsciously, all of us have gone through our own trauma. We've all gone through our own difficulty. Emotionally, we've had maybe bad relationships. And so we have an aversion to the idea that life can be truly incredible. I'm actually getting to a place in my life where things are starting to get really, really good. Yes, there's challenges. Yes, there's obstacles. But my relationships, even with my wife, my kids, the 3 kids we adopted, even we have so many miracles and amazing things going on in my life. Financially, things are going really well. Career-wise, things are great. Spiritually, things are evolving. That when things start going well, you start to question if that should be, because maybe you've gone through so much challenge in your life or things have been a grind. And so then, and this is the idea of what Gay Hendricks would call the upper limit problem, you ultimately subconsciously self-sabotage to get yourself back to your emotional comfort zone, which is more in the grind, frustration. You ultimately needlessly create what would be considered valleys. Another great book on this subject is called Peaks and Valleys by Spencer Johnson, where he just talks about how in our lives, the valleys, often many of the valleys are unnecessary because of what we're doing on our peaks. You get onto a peak in life and you ultimately end up flushing it down the toilet because on that peak, you're not comfortable there and you don't actually believe you deserve it, or you don't think ahead to the next vision. Without purpose, people perish. Main point here that I want to say when it comes to identity is that you want your identity to be rooted in your desired future self, and you don't necessarily need to cap what that identity is. Your identity is simply the vision. And my invitation to you is make that vision deeply intrinsically motivating, deeply inspiring to you. And it's okay if no one else understands it. It's also okay if no one else sees it. Most people on the outside are going to look at you and they're not going to see your 10x future self. They're not going to see what you believe you could have or desire. What they're going to see is your current self, or even more accurately, most of them are going to see your former self. This brings up a big idea in psychology called the consistency principle. Dr. Robert Cialdini talks about this a lot in the book Influence. But the consistency principle is the idea that as people, we like to be perceived by others as consistent. And this desire to be consistent can actually keep us stuck as our former selves because we were someone in the past. And so to keep things in homeostasis, to not rock the boat in our relationships, we will continue to act consistent with our former selves so that people see us the same way, even if we want something different. If you want to become exponential, if you want to make massive leaps, ultimately you want to envision a seemingly impossible future self that is something that you deeply want. I love the quote from Napoleon Hill. He said, "Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, the mind can achieve." The idea of conceiving, mentally mapping. Albert Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge. Also, deep honesty. All progress starts by telling the truth. Thinking about a future self that's between you and you. And no one else will see it. No one else would believe it. But ultimately, you've got to get to the point where you conceive and believe. Now, getting to the place of belief ultimately takes us to the second level. So the first level of this model is identity. That is where you start to map vision and ultimately be honest with yourself and stretch that vision to impossible levels and actually accept and allow that you can have ultimately things that it's your choice, your life, yours to create. It's that canvas that you create. It's not a role to fulfill. But in order to actually realize that, yes, you mentally map it, but getting to the place of going from seeing to feeling or believing and then ultimately knowing ultimately takes us to the second level, which is character. Your character is who you actually are. And the easiest way to look at character is that it is your minimum standard. How I look at it is your identity is the vision, but character is the strategy. Another way of looking at this, and this comes from Tony Hsieh, who created the company Zappos, is he said that to the individual, character is destiny. To the organization, culture is destiny. And so how I look at it is your vision is your identity. That is what you see, what you're willing to mentally map, what you're willing to envision. But your character is the strategy. Your character is ultimately your destiny. And what you want to do is you want to take your vision, which is your identity, and you want to normalize it as fast as possible into your character. So how do you do that? What you do is you ultimately set a very, very high floor or minimum standard. What I mean by minimum standard is your character ultimately represents mostly what you say no to. Your identity represents what you say yes to. The biggest part of ultimately becoming your desired future self and achieving impossible goals comes down to character, and character again comes down to your floor. Your identity is your ceiling, your character is your floor. And another word for floor is filter. Your floor and your filter are the same thing, and if you want to actually realize your identity, you actually need to set an extremely high floor that is very uncomfortable. This brings us to a great model by Dan Sullivan called the 4 C's formula. The 4 C's formula is first you have to commit. Second, that commitment, which is to something massive, something beyond anything you've done, ultimately leads you to courage. The courage to pursue it, but also the courage to let go of the things that are below the floor now. And so you ultimately do need to set a really high floor that ultimately keeps you in the pursuit of your future self, in the pursuit of your identity. And you've got to start letting go of many things that got you here. In the book 10x is easier than 2x, we talk about how every time you go 10x, applying the 80-20 principle, you're going to have to let go of 80% of your life. Well, the floor that I'm talking about, character, is basically the dividing line between that. The floor divides the 80 from the 20, and you ultimately can only stay in the 20 and go really deep into that. And that's level mastery, and ultimately everything else gets filtered out. As people, we really are what I would say framers and filterers. The framing comes down to the story, the vision, the idea of our future self. That's the frame. You also frame your past, which can be done powerfully and strategically, but the frame is the story, the narrative, the arc, the picture, the emphasis. And so we frame our vision, but then we filter out everything that doesn't fit that. And so ultimately, the frame is the vision, and the strategy is the filter. The filter means you say no to almost everything. Let us return to Warren Buffett. He did not make his billions by cost-benefit analysis, rather, simply by establishing a high filter, then picking opportunities that pass such threshold. The difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. The second one comes from Poor Charlie's Almanac about Charles Munger. So this is what it says. Charlie's exhaustive screening process requires considerable self-discipline and results in long periods of apparent inactivity. Charlie generally focuses first on what to avoid, that is, on what not to do, before he considers the affirmative steps that he will take in a given situation. This is why I said that the vision is your identity, but the strategy is your floor. And the strategy ultimately comes down to what you say no to. That is why it is the filtering process. This is what I'm talking about when it comes to floor and filter. Your floor is ultimately your strategy, and you want a floor that's so high that you say no to almost everything. One of the other things that you will learn as you're starting to grow exponentially is it's not just about the type of people in your life. Yes, Dan Sullivan and I wrote a book called Who Not How. And going for 10x growth or going for exponential growth usually comes down to who, not how. But one of the things that you learn as an entrepreneur or as a leader is that ultimately, to make big leaps over and over, it comes down to the quality of who's, just like it comes down to the quality of what you say no to. You want to have a really high floor or standard and say no to a lot of the things that your former self said yes to. The main point here is that the vision is what you say yes to. The strategy is ultimately, fundamentally what you say no to. That's why Charles Munger said that he spends most of his time at the beginning of a quest saying no to almost everything. James Clear actually said something great about this recently, where he said that novices are focused on what they don't know how to do, whereas masters, they know what not to do. And so ultimately, it first comes down to, first off, mapping the vision of your future self, getting really clear, getting really connected, being really honest. Then second, setting such a high floor. And this takes massive commitment and confidence. It takes massive commitment and courage, actually, to start saying no to almost everything. And to then, after you've begun weeding things out, filtering things out, letting things go. This takes a lot of emotional development, letting things go, even letting things go that are good but are stopping you from being great. You've got to trust in your future self enough to let go of pathways, people, situations, relationships that may be lucrative, that may be awesome, but given the vision, and you let the vision dictate the floor or the strategy and the filter, you start saying no to stuff. And you start saying no to stuff that you really want to say yes to out of security, out of short-term dopamine. But as you watch yourself start saying no to anything below that floor, even incredible stuff, then you will start to really build the subconscious and the identity. You will really start to build the character that then can help you achieve your 10x or your impossible vision. But you've got to actually apply it. And applying it means you set a really high floor and you start saying no to almost everything that doesn't fit. And you then, after you've begun weeding stuff out, you will then create the space mentally, emotionally, spiritually to then figure out and focus on that 20%. But you won't get that insight and you won't get that conviction of where to focus and where to master, call it the 20% of the next journey. You won't get that unless you first start weeding stuff out and setting that really high bar and start saying no and filtering out and sifting out stuff. As Munger said, the first primary focus after establishing a goal is to start weeding out almost everything that doesn't fit. And it's by uncommitting to that, by weeding that out, and by watching yourself do that, by creating those points of no return, by actually learning. You can know you've learned by when you say the juice is no longer worth the squeeze, whether that's with people, with behaviors, with addictions, with, honestly, even paths and pursuits that are, once you've gotten to the point where you say, I'm good, I don't need that anymore, it's no longer worth my investment of attention, time. I can see that if I let that go and invest deeper here, that this is worth exponentially more, way more leverage, way more growth, way more opportunity. So first step, vision, identity. Second step, character, floor, which is about what you filter out and say no to almost everything. And then from there, increasingly getting clear and clear on where you want to develop unique mastery and depth. This is a concept that I really love, and the concept is called thesis. Your thesis is ultimately your philosophy. Your thesis is basically what you value. Like your thesis establishes why you're pursuing the goal you're pursuing or the purpose you're pursuing, whether it's in business or life. Your thesis presents the why, the what, and ultimately the how. When it comes to my own thesis and thinking to the idea of so good they can't ignore you, I would rather focus my time and attention on becoming so good I can't be ignored in various areas, called the areas where I'm intrinsically motivated, in the areas where I want to develop mastery, in the areas where I feel I can become incredible. For me, in my case, that's going to be psychology. It's going to be exponential growth. It's going to be writing incredible books that sell copies to the right people and ultimately helping individuals, organizations achieve exponential growth. That's for me. Also, honestly, thinking about my own future self, certainly becoming a much more devoted, loving husband and father. But these are the areas that are resonant with my future self, with what I value, and they could fit within my thesis of life, my thesis of how I'll focus, where I'll invest, and so ultimately we all have a thesis, and it's really powerful for you to actually write down your thesis, and your thesis being kind of your core philosophy and why you're pursuing what you're pursuing and how you're pursuing it strategically versus some other path. Part of my thesis, just sharing openly and honestly, was letting go of my YouTube channel because I felt like that investment of time, energy, and effort was less valuable than me just honestly putting more time and effort into becoming so good I can't be ignored in writing incredible books for the types of people I want to write those books for. Main point here is that this level of mastery is ultimately going to be really deep. I love the quote, it's better to be a meaningful specific than a wandering generality, and it's up to you where you're going to develop intense, unique mastery that becomes so good it can't be ignored. And that's where you're going to put your deep focus and flow. And by doing that, ultimately, you're going to make quantum leaps as your future self. Your life's going to become incredible. And so these are the 3 levels. And I'm writing about these in my new book, Rapid Transformation, which comes out later this year. So you've got your identity, which is the vision. You've got your character, which is the floor and the strategy, which is ultimately saying no to almost everything. And then with that space and conviction, by actually letting go of your former self, you can then go deep on your new level of mastery and becoming so good you can't be ignored. As a core part of your thesis, these are the areas where you want to become incredible and knowing deeper and deeper the why behind that. Hope that was helpful. Hope that was useful. Really excited to be with you and have an absolutely incredible 2024. You can achieve 10 years growth every single year. And in later videos, I'm going to talk about how to achieve 10 years growth every year, as well as a 90-day process by which you can actually, achieve way over what you achieved the year before each quarter. And so it's incredible. You can achieve a year-long growth every quarter. You can achieve a decade's worth of growth and transformation every single year. Have an amazing day. See you.